Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar, which is an overview of APA style. Thank you for those of you who are attending live, and if you're listening in, welcome. You can always reach out to us with questions at the Online Writing Center at the chicagoschool.edu. Those of you who are on live, I do have my question box open, and I do encourage you to ask questions as I go through tonight's slides. I know that APA can feel overwhelming if it's a style that's new to you or you're coming back to school after some time off, and that there are a lot of nuances to APA style. So definitely ask questions as they come up. My name is Dr. Heidi Marshall. I coordinate our online writing center. I'm also an adjunct faculty here at the Chicago School in the BA program. I'm very excited to be with you tonight. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to dive right in. As I mentioned, again, feel free to pop questions into the question box as we go. I will try to get to them as I see them, but if I don't see them right away or I'm not able to get to them, just hang tight. I will answer all your questions. So why do we use APA style? Why is there so much emphasis, not just here at the Chicago School, but in general on making sure we're citing our sources, that we're doing that with APA style? So there's several reasons. First, APA is used by the Chicago School because we are by and large a school with degree programs in the social sciences almost exclusively. So we use the citation style and the writing style of the social sciences, which is dictated by the APA style manual. So that's why we're using APA as opposed to the many other style manuals that are available. So now that we're using APA, the reason we have to do this, the reason we need to be citing our sources and have accurate reference lists, by and large, is that we need to make sure that we are giving credit where credit is due. When you are writing your papers, regardless of what that written assignment is, whether it's a discussion post, whether it's a recap of some reading that you had that week, or if it's a more complex assignment like a research paper, you have to incorporate the ideas of other people. You're going to be incorporating the ideas from the sources that you read in order to craft that particular assignment. And as an academic, so as someone who's enrolled in academia, and really just in general, we have to uphold particular ethical standards. And in Western education, that means that we have to give credit where credit is due. So when you incorporate the ideas of other people into your writing, you have to cite them because they're not your ideas. Those ideas belong to other people. As I mentioned, several styles of citation exist. At the Chicago School, we are using APA. And the purpose, again, we're giving credit where credit is due. We're also, with our citations, showing our reader, hey, if you want to learn more about this thing that I'm talking about, or if you want to go find this source that I just cited, your reference list has all of the information needed for your readers to go find that original source. So you're also giving your readers a little tip. Say, here's where you go and get this information. So again, we're going to give credit where credit is due, building our credibility as a researcher as well. So through all of this, you come across as more credible when you are citing your sources. It makes you look as though you know what you're talking about, right? When you put a blanket sweeping generalization in a paper, or when you read one. So for example, if you read a classmate's discussion post, or even something in the news, in a newspaper, in a magazine, and it seems like a really bold statement, and there isn't any citation or evidence to back it up, we sort of immediately begin to question that, right? And you don't want to be in that place where your readers are questioning you because you are making strong assertions without supporting those assertions with evidence. So we are also building our own credibility through using citation. We incorporate the ideas of others into our writing in three ways. The very basic way we do this is through direct quoting, and that is a word-for-word replication of the original content. So you are literally copying and pasting. Once you do that, you have to put that text into quotation marks. It's in quotation marks when it's 40 words or under. I'm going to show you an example of what to do when you want to put in a quote that's longer than that. So we have our direct quotes. They need to be cited. We also summarize. So this is when we perhaps are crafting an annotated bibliography and we need to summarize an entire article or an entire chapter or something of that nature. And so we're giving a very faithful sort of reproduction, but in our own words. So we've changed not just the words, but the sentence structure entirely into our own words, but we're still conveying all of the main ideas. That's called summarizing, and it needs to be cited because it's not our own ideas. Even though we've put it now into our own words, it's not our own ideas yet. And then we also paraphrase. So paraphrasing, unlike summary, where you're summarizing an entire section or an entire article, in paraphrasing, what we do is we hone in on one very specific idea. And we put that idea again into our own words. And then we begin to integrate that idea maybe into a literature review or into a research paper where we're beginning to compare ideas, contrast ideas from different authors. So that's called paraphrasing, when you're taking just smaller snippets of ideas and piecing them together with other information. But all of those little bits and pieces of paraphrased information have to be cited because, again, they're not our own information or they're not our own ideas, they're somebody else's. So how do we go about doing this? There's a few different conventions that I want to talk to you about tonight. These are the most common sources and source citations that we see in student writing, but I do want to put a disclaimer out, but that there's by no means is this an exhaustive list of how to cite and reference everything, because we'd be here for hours if we were going to go through that. So I'm giving you the basic formula for APA citations and references, but again, it's not an exhaustive list, but it should help you be able to cite and reference just about everything that you come across. Okay, so if we have a source with a single author, this is any source whatsoever, an article, a book, a chapter in a book, okay, any source at all where there's just one author. You are going to, there's two different ways that we can cite, actually, and I should clarify this. So when we are citing in a paragraph, and I'll bring an example of this up, when you're citing in a paragraph, you can do that in two different ways. You can use what's called a parenthetical citation, as I have here. Bring up my highlighter. So a parenthetical citation means quite literally that the information is within parentheses. And this is the style of citation that we see at the end of a sentence usually. We can also use what's called an inline. This is also sometimes called a narrative citation. And a narrative citation means that now your author name is actually part of the text of your sentence. So then usually you have a verb coming right here. Excuse my scribbles. So you have your author is often the subject of your sentence followed by a verb. So that's parenthetical citation or inline. And when you have just one author, if you notice, it's a pretty simple formula, right? So you have the last name. When it's a parenthetical citation, you have a comma, and then you have the year. When it's an inline citation, you do not need that comma. So no comma between the author and the year, but the year will still appear in parentheses immediately following the author's name. Now, if you have a source with two authors, this is where things start to change up a little bit. So same thing, we have both a parenthetical or an inline example. When you have two authors of a source, you will use what's called an ampersand in between the two author names when it's in a parenthetical citation. When you're using an inline or a narrative citation, then you're going to change that ampersand and you're going to actually write out the word and. Whoops. So when you have a source with three or more authors, which more often this is the case, right? We are reading research articles that were written by groups of people. So there's multiple authors. And in the 7th edition, APA manual states that we can now abbreviate all of those citations. So anytime you have a source with three or more authors, you're going to abbreviate to the first author's last name, followed by the Latin abbreviation et al. I want you to pay attention to how this is punctuated, because this is an error we see quite a bit in student writing. Et al is a Latin abbreviation. It means and others. Okay, so the AL is a shortened version of the Latin word for others. And so you have to put a period after it because it's an abbreviation. But there aren't any other periods. So there's no period after the ET, just after that AL. And like with our other citations, there is in the parenthetical citation, there's a comma between the author name and the year, but in the inline citation, there is no comma there. So that's our most common citation formats. There are some other less common things that you might encounter. So for example, personal communication. This is something perhaps you've been tasked with conducting an observation or an interview with somebody for a class assignment. And so you are um, able to document what they said and you want to incorporate what they said into your writing, but there really isn't any way to go and retrieve that after the fact because it doesn't exist anymore. It only existed in that moment when you were observing or listening or talking with somebody. So we call this personal communication. And so you still need to cite it, right? And you're going to put as much identifying information about the person you can. So if you can use their first initials and last name, you want to do that. Sometimes you need to protect their identity, so you have to come up with a pseudonym, or perhaps you can just use their job title instead of their name. If you can use their name, though, do go ahead and do that. And then you are actually going to write out the words personal communication and then the exact date on which that communication took place. One nuance about this is because this isn't information that your reader can go and retrieve, you don't actually have to put this on your reference list. So this will be the only type of in-text citation that does not also have a corresponding reference list entry. Sometimes we also have what's called secondary source material. So I'm going to do some highlighting here. So with my green highlighting, I'm highlighting the article that we actually read. Okay, now I'm going to come down and I'm going to use, in my blue highlighting is going to indicate somebody who was quoted or paraphrased within the article that we read. So in this case, we read an article written by Cook in 2018. And in Cook's article, they cited Marshall, 2016. Okay, and what we want to do in this case is we want to use the information that came from Marshall. However, we didn't actually read the Marshall source, we read the Cook source. So now we have to give credit to both of these authors. So we're going to do that by citing Marshall because that's where the information came from originally. But then we have to say as cited in and then include the source where we actually read that information. I do want to put in a quick caveat here that you want to avoid this style of citation as much as possible. Okay, because it can really lead, or, we think about, as I mentioned, part of our role here is to build our own credibility. And you want to make sure that you are not misrepresenting anybody else's ideas. So when we do this, when we do a secondary source citation, we're really putting a lot of trust in the fact that Cook has accurately represented the ideas of Marshall. But, we can't really guarantee that. So our best bet is to go to the reference list in Cook's article, find the Marshall article and go read that for ourselves so that we can be sure the information is being presented accurately, that we have a really good understanding of what Marshall actually meant, the context in which that information was presented in the original source. So as much as possible, you want to be using primary source material rather than that secondary source. Another thing too is that if you do use a secondary source citation, the only source that can appear in your reference list is the source that you actually read. So Marshall, in this case, would not appear in your reference list, only the Cook source. Sometimes too, we attribute a single idea to multiple people, right? It's a common idea, but we still want to cite it. We want to say that multiple researchers have found something to be true, perhaps, or have made a common assertion, which is perfectly fine. We can do that. When you do that, when you list multiple sources, you want to list them alphabetically. Okay. Notice that by last name. So it's basically the same order that they are appearing in your reference list. And notice too that in this parenthetical citation, I'm using a semicolon in between each source. That's to separate out. That's sort of a visual cue to my reader that these are separate sources. You can also do this in an inline or a narrative citation. Again, you're going to just list them alphabetically, so the same order they appear. When you're using that narrative citation, though, instead of a semicolon, you can just use a comma. So again, you're listing those sources alphabetically. So let's talk a little bit. So now we know how to cite, right? Like what is it, the logistics of it, how it actually looks, but how do we know when to cite? So per APA, you are going to cite only the works that you've read. We just talked about that, and ideas that you've incorporated in your writing. So in other words, every source that you cite in your paper also has to appear on your reference list and vice versa. Okay, so if you don't cite it, you don't have to put it on your reference list. And again, you can only cite sources that you've actually read. I just reiterated that. In addition, you are going to cite a source each time you introduce a quote, summary, or paraphrase from that source in a single paragraph. So when you're writing, it's really important to think about your paragraphs as sort of their own entities, their own units, and because citation rules apply paragraph by paragraph. And so every time you introduce an idea from a source in a paragraph, you have to cite that source. Even if you've cited it in the preceding paragraph, you have to recite that source. Okay, so remember each paragraph is its own entity. So you need to recite every time you introduce a piece of information from another source. If you are going back and forth, again, piecing together paraphrased information, so synthesizing ideas where you're going to have multiple citations in a single paragraph, you need to recite each time you go back to pulling from a source, even if you've already cited it, right? So if you cite, you know, Guzman in the first sentence, and then you cite Marshall in the second sentence, and then you want to go back and cite something else by Guzman, you have to recite that Guzman source. So you always need to make sure it's very clear to your reader what information is coming from what source. You want to vary your citation style. So remember, there's two options. You can use that parenthetical citation, or you can use that inline or narrative citation style. And often you want to vary it up a little bit because that creates a more engaging writing style. It avoids some redundancy. You know, it can feel a little redundant just to have parenthetical citation after parenthetical citation. And you just need to accept too, if you are joining us tonight on getting ready to write a literature review or write sort of a more comprehensive research paper, you do just sort of need to accept that some of the paragraphs in there are going to have a lot of citation. You might even have paragraphs where you have a citation in almost every sentence, and that is perfectly normal. That means you have done your work. You've given credit where credit is due. You're building your credibility by showing where that information came from. So here's just an example of what that might look like, right? When we are introducing ideas. So in this first sentence, this is the first place I've introduced an idea from my first source, which is Duke and Beck. And then I introduce a new information from another source. So I'm going to add a citation, but then I'm going to go back in my next sentence. I'm going back to my first source. So I have to recite that first source again. And now I'm going to conclude my paragraph with yet another thought from another researcher. So here, this is an example of what's called a synthesized paragraph, where I've taken bits and pieces from 3 different sources. I've paraphrased that information, and I've sort of woven it together to create an idea, a paragraph. So I mentioned with direct quotes, there are some specific rules that we need to follow. When you are directly quoting, you have to have a page or paragraph number on where that quote appears in the original source. Okay, so your citation has to include not just the author name and the publication year, but again, also that page or paragraph number where the source appeared. If it's a single page, you use a single P followed by a period. If it spans multiple pages, you're going to use 2 P's followed by a period. And then if it's a web page that doesn't have pages, you can use the paragraph number. So you can sort of count down the paragraphs on that page and use the paragraph number. A couple other nuances, and this actually happens more often than you might think, is that sometimes you have in a research paper, you've incorporated multiple sources, and you realize that 2 people on your reference list have the same last name, but they're actually different people. This is going to be the only instance where APA permits the use of first initials in the citation. Okay, so because you want to distinguish for your reader that even though they have the same, these authors have the same last name, they're in fact different people. So that is just one. So then you can use their initials to differentiate them from one another. All right, so we mentioned if you have a direct quote that is 40 words or 39 words or under, so under 40 words, you're going to use quotation marks. However, if your quote is 40 words or longer, you're going to use what's called a block quote. A block quote means you're going to indent the entire quote. So this entire left margin is going to be indented a half an inch. The right margin, you can just let run flush with your right margin. You don't need to justify it, and you don't need to indent it on the right-hand side. You're only indenting on the left. Okay, you are going to end that quote with a period and then put your citation. What that does is say to the reader, okay, my big block quote is over, and now I'm citing it. Okay. So again, indenting the entire thing on the left, the punctuation before the citation. Also remember that direct quotes don't end your paragraph. They shouldn't be the end of a paragraph, right? They serve as evidence in our paragraphs. So they shouldn't be the end of our paragraph. So after your block quote, the next line should begin on the left margin. That line should not be indented because you want to show that you're still in your same paragraph. Okay, I'm going to pause just a minute, a few seconds here. Any questions on citation format? You can raise your hand and I can unmute you, or you can type in the chat box. Excuse me. Okay, let's talk about book reference format. I'll start with books. So how do I reference a book? And I will say, no matter what source you're referencing, the same formula applies. So APA really just has a single formula to use for all reference list entries. And that formula is as follows. First is the author name. Okay. Second is the publication year. Third is your source title. And fourth is the publisher information. Okay, so author name, year, source title, publisher information. Now, what goes in each position, 1, 2, 3, 4, that's where we start to see some variation, but it's always that order. Author name, year, source title, publisher information. Okay, in a book, this is the simplest formula, right? Because it doesn't matter how many authors we have, those will always go first, then the year. Your title of your book is in italics, and then your publisher. That's it. End of your book reference. If it's a chapter in an edited book, it's a very similar format. So notice my author name, my year, title of my source. And now here's where my publisher information becomes a little longer because I have to say that this chapter was published in a book. And so I have to also give you the book information. And in this case, you're going to say it was in, you're going to list the editors of that book, the title of the book, the page numbers of the chapter, and then the publisher house. Okay, but still remember the formula still applies here. Same with journal articles. So they begin with the author name, the publication year, the title of the source, and then the publisher information. And in a journal article, your publisher information includes the title of the periodical, the volume number, so that's that, the issue number, that's in parentheses, so volume number is in italics, issue number is in parentheses, the page numbers of the article, and then you're going to put in your permanent DOI link. Okay, so it used to be that we could just pop that DOI number in, but now it actually has to be a URL. So it's a permanent DOI link. And that's really, I mean, that's really it. So it really, again, it doesn't matter what other sources you might have to reference. They're always going to follow this same format. Okay, and at the end of tonight's session, I'm going to bring up our website and show you where you can find a really great tutorial to figure out how to generate different reference types. All right, so let's move on to formatting. So APA also has some specific guidelines on how your document should look, and the Chicago School has some additional nuances that I want to talk to you about tonight. So let's talk about your course papers. Okay, your course paper should be formulated per APA style. And according to APA, and so this is for course papers. This is not for your final. If you're a PhD student or doctoral student with us tonight, this does not apply to the dissertation template. Your dissertation is going to look a little different, but this is for all of your coursework. You do not need a running head. So there's no running header here. You don't need any text in the upper left. However, you do need a page number in the upper right, and that page numbers are going to begin with page 1 on your title page. You also need a title. Okay, that title is going to be in bold font. It's going to be in what's called title case, which means you've capitalized all of the major words of that title. Okay, then notice you're going to have a little bit of extra space. So the entire title page is going to be double spaced. And then between your title and your own name, you're going to add an extra space. So you're going to hit that enter key on your keyboard one extra time to create a little bit of extra white space. And the reason we do this is to help that title stand out on the page a little bit more. So again, pagination, it's continuous throughout the entire document. It starts with the title page as page 1. You don't really want to use any section breaks. You want to, in Microsoft Word, use page breaks in order to begin your text at the top of a new page. Again, your page numbers appear in the upper right corner. And make sure that you're using automatic pagination instead of manually inserting. So you want to, do insert page number rather than typing the page numbers in yourself. In APA style, we also use what are called heading levels. This is to help create a hierarchy of information in our papers. They're sort of like your paper has a built-in outline. And as a matter of fact, when you are writing your papers, I strongly recommend you use an outline and that you use these APA heading levels to create that outline. Our first heading level, so level 1 heading, it's centered on the page, it's bold, it's in title case, okay? And these level 1 headings, these are the major sections of your paper. If you were writing a course paper and it's anywhere, and it's like, no more than 6 pages, there's a very good chance that you'll only use level 1 headings throughout that paper because you really just have a few major sections. You will move on to subheadings when you need to begin to divide those major sections into multiple subsections, just for clarity, to help it flow, and again, for organization. You want to think about your headings as like a built-in outline for your reader. So you'll then move down to a level 2 heading. It's flush left, bold. It's also title case. If you are going to divide then a level 2 heading, you move to a level 3, which is italicized. And then levels 4 and 5. Now it's pretty rare that we get down to this level of subsection. Typically we only see this in something as long as a dissertation. And even then, not all dissertations use this level of heading. So, but if you do need to break it down even further, you can move to these level 4 and level 5 headings. There's a quick distinction. So in the 7th edition, some of the rules of headings changed. And the primary one being that for your level 3 heading, that is now separated from your paragraph. That didn't also always be the case, used to be the case. Also, all headings are now in title case. So remember, title case means that you capitalize all of those major words, and they are all going to be bold font as well. And I want to talk a little bit about the hierarchy here. So remember, your headings are an outline, and outlines help. They're like a roadmap for your reader, but they are also a hierarchy of information. So when you're using level one headings, what you're telling your reader is all of the information under the level one headings in my paper is as important as all of the other information under the level one headings, right? So those are the need to knows. This is the most important information. And similarly, when you get down to a level two heading, what you're saying is I've broken this down into multiple sections and each is equally as important as the other one. So everything under a level two heading here is as important as everything else under the level two heading and so forth. So you're really creating a hierarchy of information with the most important being what appears under that level one heading. Spacing rules. So we're going to use a single space after every punctuation mark. So when you end a sentence, you put a period. You are just going to use one space. We used to have to use two. Now we're down to one space. So that's spacing after a punctuation mark. Now in terms of line spacing, again, you are going to double space the entire paper. Include the title page, abstract, headings, block quotes, reference list. Everything is going to be double spaced. The only exception is that if you have text, if you've inserted a table or a figure, you can use single spacing in that table or figure if it improves the readability. Also, if you have footnotes, these are very rarely used. Most instructors prefer students not use footnotes. However, if you do, you can also single space those. So here's an example of a properly formatted APA table and a properly formatted APA figure. When we have tables, you have to label each consecutively throughout the document. So the first table is table one, the first figure is figure one, the second one is table two, figure two, and so forth. So you've labeled them consecutively. When you put in that table number, figure number, that's going to be bold. Okay, it's sort of like its own heading level, so you're going to help it stand out a little bit. And then you're going to follow that with a descriptive title for the table or the figure. Notice that the descriptive titles are in title case, but they are italicized instead of in bold font. Okay, so these titles, you want to keep them pretty brief, right? Under a single line, I'd say 6 to 8 words maximum. They should be descriptive but concise. If you need to add more information, then you can do that in a note underneath the table or the figure. So if you need to add attribution or a further description, you want to do that in a note underneath the figure or the table. Another thing to notice, and I know this is a very basic type table here, it only has 2 rows, but notice that there's no vertical lines. So APA really wants the formatting of your tables to be very clean. So you're not going to have any vertical lines in there. So when you're creating your table, you only want to use lines around your column headers, and then again at the very end of the table. APA also has some nuanced rules around numbers. So our general rule for numbers is that if it is 10 or higher, you're going to express it as a numeral. And if it's 9 or lower, you're going to write it out. However, as is always the case with APA, there are a number of exceptions to this general rule. So you will also use numerals to represent statistical or mathematical functions, percentages, elements of time, dates, ages, and so forth. Okay, so if it refers to an element of time, money, or mathematics, you are going to be using a numeral instead of writing out that word. Sometimes we have to make lists in our documents. If you are using a list within a narrative, okay, you are going to do that using lowercase letters and parentheses. So critical reading strategies include A, scanning, B, questioning, C, reading, D, reviewing, and E, relating. Okay. You can also, though, use bulleted lists. Okay, and a vertical bulleted list would be used to convey the steps in a process or a specific order of events, for example. So one thing about using lists, so this is called seriation. So when you want to seriate particular words that you're listing, it's only necessary when the order of that list matters. So if the order of the list doesn't matter, then you don't need to do any of this. You can just write it out as a simple narrative list without putting these letters in or without using a bulleted list. Okay. Sometimes we also want to abbreviate information. So to make our sentences more concise or to avoid having to say super long titles or names over and over again. And that's permissible. So for APA, what you want to do is the first time that term appears in your narrative, so anywhere in your paper, the very first time, that's when you're going to define the abbreviation. So for example, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and then I put CDC in parentheses. So now what that has done is defined that abbreviation. So from there on out in my paper, I can just use that abbreviation. Same for disorders. So if you want to, major depressive disorder, MDD. So now I've defined that abbreviation and I can use it from there on out. So APA also has some interesting rules around hyphenation or spelling of compound words. So in general, and I will say your Microsoft Word settings might not like you very much for this, but you can adjust them. And I actually just on Monday did a webinar on how to adjust your Microsoft Word spell and grammar check. So if you didn't view that, I recommend you go find that recording. It's on our website. So how you can adjust what Microsoft Word flags as incorrectly spelled words. But in APA, you do not want to hyphenate words that begin with these common prefixes. And these are places, these are words you might see hyphenated in what you're reading, but the APA rule is that you will not hyphenate these words. They should all be written out as a single word. However, you will hyphenate any self compound. I know that's a really nuanced rule. Don't worry if you don't remember rules like this as you're writing. You're always going to have kind of a crummy, what we call a crummy first draft, that when you're drafting your writing, it's going to be riddled with errors. Everybody, even the best writers, their first drafts are riddled with errors. And you don't want to worry about that too much when you're drafting. It's when you go back to revise your work, to edit and proofread it before you submit it. That's when you want to start thinking about these rules. You can even use, some of the slides of this presentation as a checklist, so to speak, right? Did I check, am I hyphenating words that didn't need to be hyphenated? Did I spell out numbers correctly? All these things. So you sort of have a revision checklist or an self-editing checklist that you can use as you go through. Capitalization. So obviously, like we've been taught since we learned how to write, you are going to capitalize the first word of a sentence. You're also going to capitalize your proper nouns. However, you are not going to capitalize the names of models or theories. This is an APA rule. And you're also not going to capitalize the names of disorders or diseases. The exception being if the theory or the disorder or the disease has a proper noun in it, then that will be capitalized, that proper noun. You will capitalize those abbreviations like we showed earlier. When do we use quotation marks? And you will only ever, if you do use quotation marks, you will only ever use double quotation marks. Don't ever use that single quotation mark. That in APA style is just not a thing. So you can use quotation marks when you need to refer to a letter or a phrase as a linguistic example. So for example, the letter Q, or participants responded yes or no. So this is really helping that single letter or that word stand out in the sentence. Right. So if you are writing a study where you conducted an experiment and you have a stimulus word or something that you were using with participants, you want to put those types of words in quotation marks. Of course, anytime that you are reproducing material verbatim, so anytime you're directly quoting, you'll put that in quotation marks, again, unless it's more than 40 words, in which case you'll use a block quote. You can also use quotation marks to introduce a word or a phrase that's ironic or slang or like a coined term or something invented. Or a label, something that you're labeling, right? So really quotation marks help text stand out in the sentence. They help the reader understand that you're calling attention to that particular word for some reason. Okay, italics we're going to use pretty sparingly. You can use italics if you're identifying key words that are immediately followed by a definition. In your dissertation, again, if you're a doctoral student with us tonight, in your dissertation, you actually are going to have a list of terms that you use, and each of those terms, so each of those key terms would be italicized. You can also use italics if you've conducted a study, like a Likert scale study, for example, and you need to indicate what the anchors of that scale mean. You will put those in italics. Let's talk a little bit about verb tense. This is an APA rule. And APA says when you are reporting on the literature review, so when you're talking about what another author did in the past, you're going to use the past tense, right? So Percy found, so Percy conducted a study in the past, Percy wrote that article in the past, and then you read that article in the past. So it makes sense that you're going to use the past tense to discuss that article, but it's really only using, it's just the action verb of what that author actually did that is going to be in the past tense, right? So people wrote about things, they noted, they found. Okay, these are all in the past tense. This is not something that you'll always see in what you read because this is a very APA specific rule. Pronouns should always clearly refer to their antecedents, right? So the APA rule, so I am going to put a disclaimer out. What I'm presenting right now is the APA rule. You do always want to check with your faculty members. Some faculty members have a strong preference against this rule, but this is the APA rule, is that you should not refer to yourself in the third person. Instead, you should always, anytime you're talking about your own steps in your own research, you should use a personal pronoun, right? So refer to yourself in the first person. We also don't want to use what's called the editorial we or this general we to refer to a group of people, right? Like we tend to rely on each other in these situations. Instead, you really want to use a precise noun to indicate to whom you are referring. So try to avoid that editorial we there. APA also is endorsing and actually requiring the use of the singular pronoun they in a few instances. Obviously, when a person, if you know that a person has identified they as their preferred pronoun, but also as a generic third person singular pronoun to refer to a person whose gender is unknown or whose gender is irrelevant in the context. So for example, each participant turned in their test. In this example, it doesn't matter what the gender of the participant was. So we can use their. We don't care what the gender was. Same here. A child should learn to play by themselves and with friends. Okay. Or a child should learn to play by themselves. Either of those is acceptable. And again, the gender doesn't matter in this particular context. So we're going to use a singular they. Really what we're trying to avoid is the awkward use of generic third person pronouns being attributed to a specific gender, right? Up until very recently, academic writing was rife with gender bias because, you would see statements referring to people using the pronoun he, him, right? Men, right? Mankind. Really preferencing the male gender pronouns. We know that that carries a lot of implicit gender bias. We want to make sure that we're not being biased in our own writing. We also know now that there are a lot more than just two pronouns that people use. And so we want to be sensitive to that and make sure that we're not being biased towards just the dichotomous pronouns, he, she, right? So just make sure you are being open, that you are being objective, you're being thorough, and you're not putting implicit bias in your writing. That is really the driver behind using the pronoun they. Just a few other things to wrap us up. I know we're just about at our time for questions. Don't use any underlining. There is no underline. happening in APA style. You don't need to use ellipses before or after direct quotes. You do not need to use, you don't want to use back-to-back parentheses. Okay, if that's the case, you want to put a semicolon. You put the information in one, separated by semicolon. Okay, I know that was a lot of information. I'm going to pause there. I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen for just a moment. And I'm going to bring up a sample paper for us to look at. So if you have any questions, I'm going to show you some of the things with pagination that I was just talking about. Or not just with pagination, but with formatting. Okay, so now we should be looking at a paper. Make it a little bit bigger for you. So as I noticed, so there's a few things wrong here. So let's pretend that this is a course paper. So remember on course papers, we said that there's no running head, but we do have to have page numbers. So we would need to go in and adjust this. So the best thing, the best way to do this is to double click. So I've got my cursor at the top of the page here, and I'm just going to double click, and that's going to open my header footer menu. So you see now at the top of the page here, I have my header footer open. I'm going to get rid of everything that's in here because it's not correct. And instead I'm going to come up. So now under header footer, I'm going to click on page number. I want that to be at the top of the page. And then I'm going to choose the option where it is at the upper right of the page. So for a course paper, that is all I need. Okay. You want your title to appear about 4 double spaces down from the top. And remember, we want to double space the entire document. You can do that if you come up to select all, so you have all the text in the document selected. And then let's pop open our paragraph menu. And under here where you see it says spacing, if you click here and you click on double, that's going to double space. Another thing I want to point out though, under the spacing, if you see it says before and after, I want you to set both of those to 0 because we want to get rid of any extra white space or that before and after spacing that sometimes defaults in Microsoft Word. So we're going to get rid of that and click OK. So now I have my entire paper double spaced. I will say too, so you're seeing some interesting marks on this paper. This is, I have on a function called show hide. It can be found on your home menu right here under the paragraph option. So when I turn it off, you see all those marks go away. And when I turn it on, you can see them. And what this does is show you everything, all of the formatting that you have in your paper. So you see, I see that this little, it's called the paragraph symbol. That shows every time I've hit the enter key. I can see where I have page breaks. I can see where I have spaces in the document and so forth. So a couple things here. Remember, our title needs to be bold, and we need to have that extra space between the title and the student name. In a course paper, your title serves as your first level 1 heading. So remember, that also has to be bold. Okay, you want to make sure too when you that your headings, when they're centered, that there isn't any extra indenting. So I'm going to make sure that there's no indenting on my heading lines here. So that is just a quick demonstration of some of those formatting rules that I mentioned. I want to thank you all for attending this evening. And I will take some time now to answer questions. If you have them, you can enter them into the question area. You can also raise your hand and I can unmute you. If you don't have any questions, I just want to say again, thank you for joining this evening. And feel free, if anything does come up in the future, again, you can reach out to us. Oh, I was going to show you our website. I'll do that real quick. You can reach out to us at Online Writing Center at the chicagoschool.edu. Okay, so from our, oops, sorry, excuse me, puppy in the background. From your community site to access the Online Writing Center, you want to click on Writing Resources, and then click on Online. And that's going to bring you to our homepage. From here, I mentioned those APA tutorials on citing particular sources. So under APA and plagiarism, you click on APA resources, and then click on references. So I mentioned we have examples on how to cite any number of types of sources. So for example, a government or agency report, a web page, even social media, if you need to cite social media, a video, an interview. So if you click on these, it's going to give you the entry format as well as provide you an example of what it should look like. So be sure to use our website. If you've never made an appointment for a paper review with the Online Writing Center, I encourage you to do that. You can also find instructions on how to do that on our webpage here. Okay, so Raquel, I see you put a question in. So is there a way I can get a copy of the overview of APA? So yes, Raquel, we actually already have that on our website. If you come, so I'll come back to our homepage. And under APA resources, we actually have this same information here. So you can find it embedded here and find more tutorials here. So it's already up on our website. The recording for tonight will also be available under our webinar and workshop page at the bottom of the page. You can see view recorded webinars. So tonight's webinar will also appear here, but we do have these resources already up. Good question. Great. Well, thank you all again for attending and have a great rest of your night.